The sun hadn't even fully broken the horizon when Miguel Antunes, a man marked by ancient silences, stopped before the field that had accompanied him since his youth. The orange light touched the damp pasture, and for a moment it seemed that everything there breathed along with him, the wind, the earth, the oxen, the memory. But there was something different that morning, something heavy, something that didn't match the beauty of the dawn, a silent torment that consumed the man from within, as if he were about to lose not only what he had, but also who he was. Miguel always believed that the countryside was his home, his safe haven, his entire life, and in a way, it truly was. From a very young age, he learned that cattle depended not only on physical strength, but on presence, care, and total dedication. He devoted every day, every part of his body and soul to keeping that enormous responsibility alive. And it was precisely this dedication, this almost sacred loyalty, that would later become the root of his deepest pain. That morning, as the sun's rays cast long shadows across the earth, he took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for a day that carried a strange, almost symbolic weight. It was as if he sensed that something was about to change, something that, however painful, had been foretold by life for a long time. And it is here that the story ceases to be merely about hard work or about a simple man from the countryside. This is an emotional, raw, real story, one of those that takes your breath away because it reminds you of truths you avoid facing. The truth is that whoever always carries the weight of the world on their shoulders will one day collapse. Miguel didn't know it, but as he gazed at the silent pasture, fate was already preparing the moment when he would be rejected, precisely by those he loved most. Ironic, cruel, unjust. Strong words that perfectly describe what was to come, because there is nothing more devastating than discovering that one's own life of sacrifice, which should generate respect, has become a reason for distance, accusation, and even contempt. And this is where the story begins to unfold, through the lens of depth psychology. Jung would call Michael the sacrificial servant, the one who gives everything to sustain the world around him. This archetype lives to serve, lives to protect, lives to ensure that no one else carries the burden he himself assumes. But this same light that illuminates his value is the one that consumes his strength. The sacrificial servant is loved while he serves, and forgotten when he breaks. He is respected while he sustains, and discarded when he can no longer give. Miguel was exactly that. A man who believed his worth was directly linked to how much he sacrificed for everyone. And for many years that worked. He was admired, sought after, seen as a pillar. But every sacrifice has a limit. Every life dedicated too much ends up exacting a price that no one but the one carrying the sacrifice is willing to pay. As the sun slowly rose, illuminating every corner of that seemingly faithful landscape, Miguel silently wondered if it was all still worth it, if there was still room for him in the hearts of those for whom he had given everything. Something inside him trembled. Something inside him knew that this doubt wasn't new. It had simply become impossible to ignore. And it is precisely there, at that fragile, human and real point, that the story truly begins to unfold towards something much bigger, much more painful, and profoundly transformative. And while Miguel stood there, motionless before his own destiny, something within him called for change. Not just change in his life, but the change that many silent, invisible, and exhausted men also need. The truth is that stories like Miguel's don't only happen in the backwoods. They happen every day, within homes, families, and hearts that have learned to survive in silence. And perhaps that's why, if you're listening to this story now, it's touching some sensitive part of your soul as well. Because when we hear about someone who gave everything and was still left behind, it's impossible not to think about our own battles, our own unacknowledged sacrifices, The moments when you also felt like you were carrying the weight of the world alone, hoping someone would notice the struggle you never had the courage to talk about. And that's exactly why this video needs to be more than just a narrative. It needs to be a space for voices, for venting, for real people. If this story touches you in any way, if you've ever experienced something similar, if you've ever been that sacrificial servant or know someone who has, leave a comment about what you want to change in your own life. Write what you no longer want to carry alone. Say, even in just a few words, what needs to transform, because when we speak, we break the silence. When we talk about it, we create a powerful connection between those who suffer and those who understand. And when we decide to change, destiny begins to change too. So comment below, what change do you need to make today? Together, we are building a space where no one carries all the burdens alone anymore. And if this story has already started to move you, leave a like right now. This helps this video reach other people who need to hear this right now. And take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, because there are still many real, profound and transformative stories coming soon. Stories that unite us, that heal us, and that remind us that no one needs to live in silence. Now take a deep breath, because what Miguel is about to face reveals an even harsher and even more necessary truth about the life of someone who has always given too much. Even before Miguel became the man marked by the silence of that heavy morning, there was the boy, little Miguel Antunes, with boots too big for his feet and eyes that shone every time his father called him to join the work in the corral. His childhood was simple, almost harsh, but filled with that raw beauty that only life in the countryside can offer. No expensive toys, no television on all day. His world was made of earth, wind, the smell of wet grass, and the distant sound of animals mooing. It is there, in the humility of his first lessons, that his story begins to take on the emotional tone that would shape his destiny forever. The father, Sir Anselmo, was a firm man with calloused hands and a low voice. He never spoke much about his feelings, but he demonstrated everything through his work. And Miguel, still a child, absorbed each gesture as if it were a secret lesson about how the world worked. He remembered the day he helped care for the first newborn calf he found, shivering with cold. It was fragile, defenseless. It seemed that a wrong gust of wind would be enough to carry it away. So Anselmo placed the animal in his lap and said, "Here in the countryside, son, we learn that everything depends on us. If you don't take care of it, nothing grows. If you don't persevere, nothing lives." These words remained etched in Miguel's memory, echoing like a kind of code of honor. And that's how he understood very early on that the countryside wasn't just a place to work. It was identity. It was belonging. It was living proof that every effort had meaning. At dawn, he was already up, sometimes rubbing his sleepy eyes as he tried to keep up with his father's pace. Other boys his age chased kites, but Miguel chased runaway calves. While most were learning to do schoolwork, he was learning to lasso, to feed, to recognize when an animal was sad, sick, or simply in need of company. And this is where his story touches on what Jung explains with such depth. It is there, in that humble childhood, that the seed of the value complex was planted through sacrifice. The boy understood, without anyone telling him directly, that to be loved, to be respected, to be considered useful, he needed to give, to surrender, to serve. He needed to sacrifice himself. Every time his father said, "Good job, Miguel," the boy's heart swelled so much it seemed almost to explode in his chest. This small recognition became proof that he was on the right path, the path of absolute surrender. But along with that sense of pride came another side, quieter, darker, which he would only realize years later. Miguel grew up believing that rest was a luxury, that asking for help was weakness, and that showing tiredness was like betraying everything his father had taught him. He never admitted when he was exhausted. He never complained when the cold cut his skin or when the sun burned his face. He learned that the countryside demanded effort, and that this effort was precisely what gave value to his existence. Without work, he didn't know who he was. Without sacrifice, he felt he deserved nothing. And that's how Miguel gradually molded himself into the adult everyone would later know. A man who carried the world on his shoulders because he learned from a young age that carrying was his job. And with each passing day of that childhood, full of simplicity and hardship, his emotional connection to the countryside grew stronger. He knew the name of every animal even before he learned to write his own law. He would pat the cows' backs as if greeting old friends. He watched the sunset as if it were a silent promise that, as long as there was light, there was a reason to continue. The curious and painful thing is that this pure, genuine, almost childlike love would later become the prison that would consume him. But at that point in his life, Miguel didn't know that. All he knew was that the countryside gave him purpose. And for a boy who grew up without luxuries, without choices, without many possible paths, purpose was the most valuable thing in the world. And before we continue, I want you to think about this with me. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you learned from a young age that to be accepted you needed to sacrifice yourself? That your worth was linked to how much you could endure in silence? If this resonated with you, leave a comment below with one of these words so I know we're in this together. I understand. I felt that before. Or, I've carried this since I was little. I want to read every comment before telling you what will happen to Miguel when life starts to exact a price for this unconditional love for the countryside. Because that's exactly when everything starts to change. When Miguel went from being just the curious boy who followed his father through the fields to becoming the man of the house, everything happened too fast. Without warning, without choice, without any emotional preparation. The truth is, life didn't ask if he was ready. Life simply placed the weight on his shoulders, a heavy, harsh, real weight, and waited for him to carry it. And Miguel, shaped from an early age by the belief that value lay in sacrifice, simply accepted it. First came the debts his father left unfinished, a silent accumulation of bills that grew like weeds in the rainy season. Then came the drought, which burned the pasture, cracked the earth, and forced Miguel to make tough decisions to keep what little remained alive. And as if that weren't enough, disease struck, spreading through the herd as quickly as the anguish spread within him. It was during this period that Miguel learned the true face of responsibility, the kind that gives no respite, doesn't ask if the heart can take it, leaves no room for dreams. He began to sleep less and less, always waiting for a different moo, a strange noise, any sign that something worse was happening. The nights became a silent battlefield, where every minute of rest was stolen by the feeling that if he dozed off, someone or something would pay the price. Often when the sun rose, he was still there, with red eyes, his shirt sticky with cold sweat, and his hands aching so much he could barely close them. His body begged for rest, but his mind said, "Not now, later." But later never came, and this absolute dedication began to leave marks that no one could see. Miguel's hands were always bruised, with deep cuts that burned when he touched the water. His skin burned under the sun, peeled, stung, and he kept going. His muscles ached to the point of trembling on their own during the night. But what hurt the most wasn't even in his body. It was inside. It was the feeling that, despite all his effort, he was always one step behind disaster, always fighting, always patching things up, always running against something bigger than himself. And yet, no one seemed to realize the magnitude of what he was facing. Instead of acknowledging the burden Miguel carried, his family began demanding precisely what he couldn't give: presence. His wife said he wasn't there anymore, that his body would come home, but his gaze remained on the field, His children complained that he never watched anything with them, never went to school events, never had time. And inside Miguel, something was weighing on him. Because he didn't want to be distant, but he was too exhausted to be anything more than necessary. And in his logic, being necessary meant being useful. Being useful meant serving. Serving meant existing. And it is at this stage that what Jung called the shadow comes into play, the part of the soul that we carry without realizing it, but which guides our steps when we are vulnerable. Miguel began to abandon himself. He no longer recognized himself in the mirror. He no longer remembered the last time he truly laughed. He no longer knew what his own voice sounded like when he spoke of something other than work. He became the kind of man who lives to put out fires without realizing that one was burning inside. It was as if each day another piece of him was being removed, and no one around him noticed that something was missing. The feeling of invisibility began to grow silently. No one sees. This phrase repeated itself like a cruel whisper in the back of his mind. He saved the flock, kept the accounts up to date, faced storms and droughts like a warrior. And yet, it seemed that nothing was enough. His family only saw his absence. His neighbors only saw his exhaustion. Routine only saw his strength, never his pain. And so, Miguel gradually disappeared within his own life. The man who carried everything on his shoulders began to feel that no one carried even a little bit of him. And before we continue, I want you to tell me in the comments if this part touched you, if you've ever felt this weight alone. Write words like, "No one sees," "I carry too much," or "Only I know my weight." I'll read everything before continuing this story, because what comes next reveals even more about Miguel's silent battle and about the limits of any human being when sacrifice becomes destiny. The storm that night didn't begin as something grand. It came first as a strange wind, too hot for that time of year, carrying a heavy silence that made the cattle restless. Miguel noticed it immediately. He knew the signs of the field better than he knew his own body. And when he looked at the sky, he felt that old tightness in his chest, the same tightness that always came before something bad happened. It wasn't just rain that was coming. It was something bigger, something that could destroy everything he had fought so hard to keep standing. Shortly before midnight, when the family was already asleep, the first clap of thunder rattled the windows. Michael jumped up immediately. The second clap was accompanied by a flash of light that illuminated the pasture as if it were daytime. And it was in that brief moment of light that he saw what he feared most. The river that had always flowed calmly behind the farm, was beginning to overflow. The water was advancing rapidly, much faster than usual. If the herd became trapped, there would be no turning back. There would be no salvation. And without the herd, he knew it would all be over. Miguel ran out into the rain, feeling the wind cutting his face like blades. The ground was slippery, and he could barely see a few meters ahead. Even so, he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The sound of the rising water, the creaking wood, the desperate mooing of the animals, everything mixed together in a chaos that seemed to swallow the entire night. He mounted his horse and rode toward the main corral, his mind racing as fast as his heart. When he arrived, the scene was desperate. The flood was raging, tearing down gates, knocking down fences, and sweeping away everything in its path. The cattle, frightened, tried to flee in different directions, colliding with each other. It was a mixture of fear, instinct, and despair. And at the center of it all was Miguel, alone, fighting against a force of nature that had no pity, no face, no limits. He shouted, whistled, and clapped his hands to gather the herd. The horse reared up, almost toppling over under the weight of the water, which already reached the animal's chest. At one point, while trying to lasso one of the heifers that was straying away, Miguel lost control. The horse slipped, and he fell hard into the current. The icy water enveloped him as if trying to pull him down. The shock was so great that he lost his breath. The current dragged him for several meters, throwing him against rocks hidden in the mud. The impact blurred his vision, And for a short, terrifying moment, Miguel thought he would never resurface. But something inside him, something ancestral, something desperate, made him fight. He grabbed an exposed root and managed to stand up, panting, dizzy, his whole body screaming in pain. And yet, he didn't give up. Even limping, even bleeding, even with his head throbbing, he kept going after the herd. The fever started there, in that brutal contact with the icy water, his body already exhausted from days without sleep. But he ignored it. He needed to save those animals, not out of vanity, not out of stubbornness, but because it sustained his family. It sustained everyone's lives. It sustained the meaning he believed he had. The entire night turned into a struggle for survival. Miguel ran, pushed, guided, and dragged animals that weighed more than he could bear. His body trembled, sometimes from cold, sometimes from fever, sometimes simply from the physical limit he had already surpassed hours before. But those who grew up believing they are only valuable when they sacrifice themselves don't know how to recognize their own limits. And Miguel continued like this until the first light of dawn. When the sun finally came out, he was on his knees, covered in mud, his breath failing and his vision blurred. The herd, at least most of it, was safe, gathered on higher ground. And seeing that brought a mixture of relief and pain so intense that he almost collapsed right there. If anyone had been watching, they would have said that this man had just faced death, and they would have been right. But the cruelest thing, the saddest thing, is that despite all that sacrifice, despite the real risk, despite the desperate struggle, Miguel still had no idea what he was about to face next. And when you understand what comes next, the first thing you think is, he didn't deserve this. Before we continue, I want to know if this part affected you. If you've ever faced storms alone, if you've ever fought against something bigger than yourself, comment with words like, "I survived, nobody saw," or "I gave everything I had." I'll read everything before continuing because the next part reveals the most painful part of this story, and perhaps the most real. When Miguel finally returned home after that night in which he practically gave his own body to save the flock, he could barely walk. His clothes were still heavy with dried mud, his face burned with deep scratches, and a fever rose like fire beneath his skin. Each step seemed to drain more energy from him than he possessed. But despite all this, inside him there was a small flame, almost childlike, waiting for someone to notice what he had done, waiting for someone to say, "You did it. I'm so glad you came back. You saved everything." He wanted, perhaps for the first time in his life, to be seen. But when she walked through the front door, the world gave her exactly the opposite back. The wife didn't even look at the injuries first. She looked at the clock, she looked at the mess in the room, she looked at the man who was there, but not at what he carried in his chest. "You spent the whole night there, not even to let us know," she said, not realizing he could barely breathe. The older children crossed their arms. "Dad, again? We never see you. Only the cattle matter." Miguel tried to explain, but his voice failed him. He wanted to tell them about the herd on the verge of death, about the current that tried to pull him away, about the pain that still coursed through his entire body. But the truth is, nobody wanted to listen. Nobody asked, nobody noticed, and in that moment his silence spoke louder than any words could. The family turned their backs on him as if he were just another nuisance, another delay, another reminder of a man who only thinks about work. And this is where the story takes on an even more painful tone. The hero who faces storms, floods, and real risks becomes a burden within his own home. It's as if all the sacrifice vanished when he crossed the gate. His world was out there, fighting, bleeding, trying to keep everything standing. But inside the house, nobody wanted to know about the struggle, only about his absence. And that hurt more than any fall, any fever, any open wound. At work, the news was even more cruel. Days after the storm, Miguel arrived for another exhausted morning, trying to hide his fatigue, pretending he still had strength. But he found whispered conversations, averted glances, and a phrase that hit him like a direct blow. "From now on, we're going to put Gustavo in charge of that sector. He's younger, more agile. You need to rest a little. Rest." That word, spoken with false care, had the bitter taste of being discarded. They didn't want him to rest. They just didn't want to depend on him anymore. The man who provided for everything suddenly became a problem. And it was striking how people no longer saw him as part of the future, only of the past, a useful past, but outdated. He was the example of someone who worked too hard, someone who didn't keep up to date, someone who no longer had the same brilliance, the same strength, the same speed. The conversations that once asked for advice now asked for space. One or two colleagues tried to comfort him with a pat on the back, but it was the kind of pat that hurts more than a real slap, the kind of pat that says, "Thank you for everything, but it's over now." And that's precisely where the most painful Jungian explanation comes in. When the sacrificial hero is not recognized, he is devoured by his own tribe. Because the tribe, the family, the work, the community, becomes so accustomed to his sacrifice that it becomes an obligation for them. To stop sacrificing is betrayal, and to continue sacrificing is invisibility. It's a prison without doors, a road that only goes straight ahead but never leads anywhere. Miguel felt it brutally. He felt that all the effort of years, the sleepless nights, the storms faced, the hidden wounds, the entire days without complaining, were dissolving as if they had never existed. He realized that the world around him only needed him while he carried everything on his shoulders. But when he fell, no one reached out a hand, no one lifted him up, no one even noticed he was on the ground. And it was at that point that something inside him began to break. A small piece at first, an almost imperceptible fragment, but it hurt more than any physical bruise. Because Miguel wasn't just tired, he was empty. And that feeling, so human, so real, so present in so many people's lives, is like an invisible wound that never heals. Before we delve into the deeper part of this story, I want you to tell me, does this resonate with you in any way? Have you ever felt discarded, replaced, ignored after giving your all? Write in the comments words like, "I didn't deserve this," "I was left aside," or "I gave everything and you didn't see it." I'll read each one before continuing, because the next part reveals the quietest and perhaps the cruelest moment in Miguel's life. When Miguel finally found himself alone, without the flock that once depended on him, without the family that no longer saw him, without the job that had replaced him as if his history meant nothing, a profound silence took over his life. It wasn't the silence of the countryside at dawn, that silence full of promise, full of life. It was a heavy, almost suffocating silence, the kind that makes the heart beat slower, as if asking, "And now, Miguel, who are you without what you sustained for so long?" For the first time since he was a boy, he realized he didn't know the answer. Everything he had been until then was linked to serving, to sacrificing, to putting others before himself. And now that the world was dismissing him, who was he? He would sit on the porch in the late afternoons, gazing at the field with empty eyes. The same field that had once been his identity now seemed like a territory of loss. Every corner brought back a memory, his father teaching him his first steps in the work, the calves he saved, the days of struggle during the drought, the nights spent watching over the herd when it fell ill. Everything that had once inflamed his heart now hurt, as if the land itself reminded him that he had lived for it and not for himself. It was strange and painful. It was like discovering that his own life had been written on a page that was now being erased before his eyes. And it is at this point that true reflection begins to take shape. Because Miguel wasn't just a tired man. He was a man who, without realizing it, had become invisible even to himself. He gave, and gave, until there was nothing left. And then he realized the great tragedy of many men. When you live to carry the world, no one imagines that you also need to be carried. His pain didn't just come from contempt, but from the cruel realization that deep down, he never considered himself important. He never saw himself as a priority. He never saw himself as someone who deserved rest, recognition, care. He believed that his only usefulness lay in sacrifice, and when they took that away from him, they took everything. It was in this void that a slow, profound understanding began to emerge, almost too painful to face. He lived for everyone but himself. He was the servant, the protector, the one who silently endures everything. But he was never Michael. He never allowed his own name to mean anything beyond responsibility. Jung already said that the servant archetype, when it doesn't awaken to its own dignity, slowly destroys itself. And now Michael understood this firsthand. He spent his life believing that value was born from sacrifice, but the price of this belief was too high. When the sacrifice ended, it seemed that he ended too. And yet, amidst all this pain, a truth began to emerge, small, fragile, but real. The realization that, as long as someone continues to believe they exist only to serve, they will eventually disappear. The servant's healing only happens when he understands that he too deserves care, attention, rest, love. When he recognizes his own dignity, when he realizes that he was not born to be used, but to exist. It was at this point, looking towards the horizon, that Miguel understood something he should have learned much earlier. There is no heroism in destroying oneself for others. There is only self-abandonment, and that's why this story needs to be heard. Because Miguel could be many men. He could be your father, your grandfather, your brother, a neighbor, or even you. There are so many invisible men in this world, so many who carry everything and receive nothing, so many who support families, jobs, entire lives, without anyone noticing the pain they hide behind the weariness in their eyes. And this leads us to the truest phrase of this journey. There are men who support the world, but no one supports them until the day they break. And when they break down, it's almost always in silence. Before we wrap up this part of the story, I want to invite you to look around and also inside. How many men like this do you know? How many carry more than they should? How many have lost their own identity trying to keep everything afloat? How many live tired but never say anything? Write in the comments what this story reminded you of. Comment with phrases like, "I know one," "I've lived through this," or "Men get tired too." I want to read each one of them because this conversation needs to continue, and in the next part, we'll delve even deeper into what happens when an invisible man finally sees himself, or when life forces him to do so.